There's good news, podcast listener. The Podcast One app version 2.5 update is available right now.
Awesome!
Which means you'll be able to directly access all the shows you really care about, anytime and anywhere you want. Adam Carolla, Steve Austin, NPR, Loveline, Dan Patrick, and a whole bunch more.
Wow!
Plus, now you can play, pause, or stop any of your favorites and pick up right where you left off later on. So go to podcastone.com now and download app version 2.5. That's podcastone.com.
The following program is a podcastone.com production.
This is the Bret, Easton, Ellis podcast.
So it seems. One life for yourself and one for your dreams. You drift through the years and life seems tame till one dream appears and love is its name.
You're listening to the Bret, Easton, Ellis podcast, and I'm here at the Podcast One Studios in Beverly Hills with Matthew Weiner, the creator of Mad Men, which is my favorite television show maybe ever. Why do we watch certain movies again and again, even though we know the story? We know how it's all going to turn out, knowing lines of dialogue, knowing what the characters are going to do, how they're going to react, who lives, who dies, knowing the ending. And yet a lot of us can watch our favorite movies over and over, even though we know the meaning of Rosebud and the arc of Charles Foster Kane, just as we know Jake Gittes will be unable to save Evelyn Mulwray, and we know who Kim Novak really is in Vertigo, and that Michael will have Fredo murdered, and how William Holden ended up in that pool in the house off Sunset, that E.T. will die and be resurrected, that Bonnie and Clyde will be ambushed, and that Woody Allen will lose Diane Keaton at the end of Annie Hall. And yet we can keep watching those movies over and over because the movies do two things that TV is still missing, and this is what separates movies from TV, and this is a conversation that we've been having on the podcast with various creators of TV shows as well as filmmakers. That even just okay movies can have it, and that is visual mood and visual atmosphere. In essence, a director, a filmmaker, using the camera to relay an idiosyncratic and personal visual style to the viewer who is watching visual content. TV is still, in this moment, essentially expositional and informational, and not particularly visual. And I'm saying this as someone who likes TV and who has sold numerous TV shows and pilots and wrote an entire season of an unproduced TV drama, which I enjoyed doing. There is no visual mood and atmosphere on television. There is only information, people in rooms, usually two, maybe three, talking to each other, relaying the information to each other within a very plain and static visual style, one or two masters, a few close-ups, and it is done in this very plain style, which is the language of TV, because of the economics of TV. There is simply not enough money or time when one is shooting a TV show to also think about, how am I going to use the camera, as movies do, as a character, as a way of relaying visual information? You don't need to do that on TV. That's not what TV is about yet. And this is why I have become very suspicious whenever this moment in television has been referred to as the golden age of television, because what does that mean exactly? Is the golden age of what? Well, it's the golden age of information. TV is something we look at, it's visual, and it all kind of looks the same. Costumes are different, eras are different, sets are varied, but because the writer is the auteur in television and not the director, we are in an odd limbo where there is a lot of smart talk and information being traded, but there's almost no visual formalism anywhere on TV. And maybe people think we are in a golden age of TV because we have all been living in a digital society obsessed with information now. Information trumping visual design, trumping visual nuance, visual mood, visual atmosphere, visual context. And maybe it's because movies just kind of suck. And yet, even a lot of movies I have problems with this year so far have a visual mood that far exceeds even the best of television. The Grand Budapest Hotel, Under the Skin, Enemy, Nymphomaniac, The Immigrant by James Gray, Magic in the Moonlight, Cavalry, Blue Ruin, The Disappearance of Eleanor Rigby, Only Lovers Left Alive, The Rover. I don't like all of these movies, but these movies simply don't look like TV. There is something that separates the two mediums. Because a TV series is where the writer is the auteur and not the director, not the filmmaker, there usually is very little visual difference between when, say, David Fincher directed the first 2 episodes of House of Cards. Very well, I might add. And those episodes suggested that a director was kind of pushing the boundaries of the visual idea of shooting a TV pilot, but not by much. And the quote-unquote style of Fincher's episodes, which become the template for how the rest of the series will look, didn't really differ that much from the way James Foley directed his episodes, or Carl Franklin directed his, or Joel Schumacher directed his. The Fincher episodes may have been the best directed, but really, by how much? And pilots, for the most part, have a tendency to look better than subsequent episodes anyway because they are the lure. The golden age of TV started announcing itself when 2 things happened. Movies, for a wide variety of reasons, were becoming less interesting, and the premiere of The Sopranos on HBO occurred, which suggested that a new kind of serious, adult, sophisticated, premium cable show could find a wide audience hungry for the kind of content that was increasingly slipping away from the movie-going experience. And this is around the same time that The Wire exists, and a few years later Mad Men, and NBC was begrudgingly airing the stylized realism of Friday Night Lights, arguably the greatest network drama ever produced. And there were a lot of other shows that viewers were getting passionate about, whether it was Battlestar Galactica or 6 Feet Under or Sex and the City. There was a different way the intelligentsia was talking about the content of TV and its meaning and its impact, the conversation that drifted from movies to TV. And I could understand that excitement with those 4 shows, The Sopranos, The Wire, Friday Night Lights, and especially Mad Men, because for me, those are 4 great series. And then, well, what else was there? It seemed to me that these shows were the exception rather than the rule, though people who loved Dexter, True Blood, The Walking Dead, Orange is the New Black, and Game of Thrones would argue otherwise. What Mad Men and The Sopranos had going for them was doubt. They were about doubt. They were about characters doubting the world they lived in. And I think this is more rare than one might think in a television series. Doubt itself is the essence of art. Doubt is the inspiration. Doubt leads to nuance and to context. What was also new was the almost literary way The Sopranos and The Wire and Mad Men mapped out their territory. Matthew Weiner, the creator of Mad Men, has said, like David Chase, that the digressions are the story, which is one of the things that made The Sopranos and The Wire and Mad Men so darkly thrilling. They had the time and the freedom to tell stories in a different way than a lot of what was on cable. And there are no digressions on network TV, and even the defenders of the golden age of TV have to admit this about network TV. When Mad Men first premiered, my mom was recommending it to me almost weekly. I had no interest in Mad Men when I first heard about it, and I would listen as my mom described the show to me and thought at some point I would get around to maybe watching a little bit of the pilot, but I didn't watch Mad Men at all during its first season on AMC until I noticed my mom wasn't talking about it anymore, and it was as if she had slowly backed away from it, while, interestingly enough, my sisters became increasingly fascinated by it, especially with Sally Draper, the daughter of Don and Betty Draper. My mother and father were roughly 15 years younger than Don and Betty Draper, and my parents were in their mid to late 20s when myself and my sisters were children in the late 60s and early 70s. But there were remnants of that early 60s Mad Men era scattered throughout my childhood. The first movie my parents took me to in a theater was actually a triple bill of James Bond, Dr. No, Goldfinger, From Russia with Love. My father subscribed to Playboy and Esquire. There was a lot of drinking. There was the treatment of women. As kids, my sisters and I were alone a lot. My mother was like Betty Draper, a stay-at-home mom. It was just something expected from women of a certain demo still in that era. These were just the times we were trapped in. My mom stopped mentioning Mad Men, and I realized when I started watching it and came to the crushing, devastating finale of the Wheel episode at the end of season 1 that she had located that this was not just a reenactment, a fetishized retelling of those years, but a searching inquiry into everything that was false and wrong about the values during those years my mother and father were young and open to the future. And I think, though my mom and I have never really talked about this, that Mad Men was just too depressing, too close, too much to bear, a reminder of everything that went wrong, a denunciation of the pleasure she perhaps took during that era when she was younger and in love with my father. And then I realized that my sister saw in Sally Draper an older kindred spirit, the disillusioned child from that era, and it became very hard to watch the show and not feel like it was being redreamt by Sally Draper. and it became why my mother didn't talk about Mad Men anymore, and my sisters, like myself, became obsessed. I also became obsessed because Mad Men seemed to take its cues not from other TV shows or from movies, but from the complexities of literature, everyone from Jane Austen to Harold Pinter to most obviously John Cheever, the tension in its silences of wanting to say what you wanted to say compared to what society demands of you were everywhere, and it suggested what the possibilities might be of the dissolving bridge between TV and, yes, literature, prose writing. And though I sometimes fantasize about what would Mad Men be like if it could have been a premium pay cable show with the requisite nudity and cursing, and sometimes I would get frustrated if I thought about that too much, and I would also think this about Friday Night Lights as well. The show's literary tonality was simply too fascinating. The show was dreamlike, drifting through its own world, unlike anything else on TV. It seemed to have been made with a control freak's precision, and that was why the show was so gripping. The subtlety of its metaphors suggested a different language than the rest of what was on TV. It more often resembled a novel, and that impacted the way I watched Mad Men. After watching the first season in basically a day on DVD, I knew from then on it was the only way I could watch it, in one long, uninterrupted weekend, much like a great novel. So I would have to sit out a season until the following year when the entire show was available. I didn't want to DVR it. I also thought that each episode resembled a highly polished, sometimes quite enigmatic short story. And by comparison, I thought everything on Breaking Bad was the opposite of what made Mad Men great. It was almost TV incarnate, a show that crudely grabbed you by your lapels. Vince Gilligan seemed much more aware of the audience in a TV way than Mad Men did. And when the final episode came on of Breaking Bad, unlike what David Chase did with the Warholian anti-ending of The Sopranos, Gilligan ultimately gave audiences exactly what they wanted. The bad guys were killed, order set in once again, everything was neatly staged for the unambiguous exit. You could hear the joyous buzz the following day in social media. Mad Men has never been that kind of show, and it's hard to imagine what kind of order will be imposed upon Don Draper and company when the series comes to an end. So, Matthew, what is your take